Okay, our final speaker for the evening assumed the leadership of the John Birch Society 7 years ago this month. At that time was a pretty difficult period for our organization. The previous administration had lacked many of the skills necessary to move the organization in the correct direction. We were suffering with the loss of membership, revenue, advertising. His assumption of the leadership began to change that, slowly, subtly. Much of the change did primarily in the work environment itself, where individuals, managers especially, were now permitted to do the jobs that they were assigned. He understands, as many of you here do, that our future will rest in the hands of younger people who have the proper understanding of their own system of government. And with that understanding, he's responsible for bringing about the Freedom Project education under American Opinion Foundation. Our school, which now teaches from kindergarten through 12th grade, this is its first full year. And online schools like Phoenix University, in their first full year, I think had 46 students. Our first full year, we have 250. And it's only the beginning. But again, the understanding that this future and these young people are necessary was a vision he had, and that vision has now become a reality. His understanding of history, his organization and management skills are just marvelous, and the organization today is thriving under his leadership. So please welcome our Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Arthur Thompson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, please. Thank you. I guess my talk is supposed to be on what you don't know about ObamaCare, and I'm going to go into it in sort of a different way that you may wonder if I'm ever going to get there. But back in the 1840s in Europe, the communist organization was a secret society known as the League of Outlaws, and then changed its name to the League of Just Men, ultimately to the Communist League. The man who was the head of the communist organization at that time was a man by the name of Wilhelm Weitling. And they commissioned two men who had some experience in writing for the communist movement, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, to write a sort of a primer, if you will, to codify how to communize a country in the coming revolutions that they were planning in 1848 in Europe. It was published just prior to the outbreak of these revolutions, and at that time a number of individuals from all over the world, including the United States, went to Europe to help these communists in what your history books tell you are the democratic revolutions of 1848. And in there, by the way, by the time that this thing came about and it failed, Wilhelm Weitling moved to the United States. He was one of those immigrants at the time that started to communize the United States at that time period. And he formed communist clubs in the United States, all over from Chicago, Cincinnati, St. Louis, New York, et cetera, et cetera. And at any rate, this book, called the Communist Manifesto, laid down 10 steps to use to communize a country once they took it over. Okay, now you've occupied Paris, you've occupied Berlin, or wherever it was going on at the time. And keep in mind that Germany was not a united country at that time. It was a confederation of independent princedoms and fiefdoms. And so they had to capture each one of those to actually communize all of what we would think of as Germany today. If you had Paris, you had all of France, because Paris was the central government It was a national government. So all they had to do was capture the capital, and they had all of France. That was not true in Germany. They had to capture Bonn, Berlin, Wiesbaden, all the rest of the principalities in order to communize Germany. These 10 steps were outlined in the Communist Manifesto, were, again, to tell them these are the steps you need to take once you come to power. The first step was the abolition of property. And when you look at these things, you mull over in your head, well, what are we doing with these 10 steps here in the United States? Now, they say in the first step of the Communist Manifesto, abolition of private property and the application of all rents of property to public purposes. That's the first step. Do away with private property and then charge everybody rent who lives on the property now owned by the government. The second step is a graduated income tax. Now, of course, we don't have that, do we? Now, the interesting thing about the graduated income tax, well, I'll wait till I'll skip down to plank number 5. This was a step to communize the country, a central bank where the government controls all credit in the issuing of money. Do we have that? What's it called? The Federal Reserve. Now, the graduated income tax and the Federal Reserve were pretty much brought in 1913 and implemented by 1914. And it was based on the election of 1912. The election of 1912 had more than 1 million people vote for out and out, on the ticket Socialist Party candidates. But you had 3 other socialists who ran for government, for the presidency at the same time. And those 3 people were, and keep in mind what I just said, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and William Howard Taft. Woodrow Wilson, we all know, was a progressive, right? What is the definition of a progressive? Socialist. You learned that from Glenn Beck, didn't you? Okay. William Howard Taft was the son of Alfonso Taft, the founder of Skull and Bones. And then the third major candidate was Theodore Roosevelt. What party did he run on? No. That's the party name that they put in your history books. What was the actual party name? Progressive Party. Yes. And if you read his speeches after he served in the White House, you can come to no other conclusion than Theodore Roosevelt wasn't any different than his nephew. He was a socialist, and I'm putting it mildly. You cannot reach any other conclusion by reading his speeches. Remember his policy? What was it? Walk softly and carry a big stick? And they told you it had to do with foreign policy, didn't they? It was also domestic policy. Don't forget that he is the man that started the whole movement to federalize property that they hadn't picked up when they first formed these states under the Constitution. You can, in the history of the United States, trace the growth of the federal government from, as you would look at the map, from east to west, or from east to west, as you would look at it, by how much federal property is in each of these states. In the original 13 colonies, there was very little federal property other than what was granted in the Constitution for post offices and forts and arsenals. But as they gradually went across to the west, they picked up more land and wouldn't allow the states to take it, until they got to Alaska, where they kept 90% of the property. But at any rate, so what happened was, in those states where they didn't pick up all these big hunks of federal property and keep it from the states, they went back through wilderness areas, national forests, etc., TVA, on and on and on and on, which was started by whom? Theodore Roosevelt. And so you see all of these things started to happen in our country, where not only were we taxed under the first plank of the Communist Manifesto, but literally where the federal government either didn't relinquish the property or came back and started to get more and grab more and control more. So then we have the income tax, we have the Federal Reserve. The rest of the articles of the Communist Manifesto generally deal with transportation, communication, and that sort of thing. The First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States grants us what? Congress shall make no law affecting what? Religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and a petition. All right. Now, basically what we're saying in this thing is, let's put it under one word, communication. There were two basic forms of communication when the Constitution was ratified, which were oral and print. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Every single method of communication that has been invented subsequently is under federal control. Telegraph, telephone, radio, television, etc. It violates the original intent of the Constitution. Transportation. Does the federal government control transportation? I thought Richard Nixon was going to split a gut when I saw him give his speech to give us the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. He was really putting one over on the American people, and he just thought it was funnier than anything. And you know how they enforced it? I mean, what power gives the President of the United States to say that I have to drive at 55 miles an hour? Money. Because if the states didn't enforce his edict, because he couldn't, it had to be done by the states, then they weren't going to get federal transportation money. It's that simple. At any rate, so we see this gradual control over all of these aspects that the Communist Manifesto desires. A couple of other things. One thing that it did was it wanted to go out into the undeveloped areas under government programs, and in these underdeveloped areas, actually develop them under the auspices of a plan of the government. Well, they've kind of changed that over the years. And instead of doing that, they realized that, oh, wait a minute, if we can get them all huddled together, we can control them better. And so they've kind of reversed that policy that they had in the Communist Manifesto. And we see that in Agenda 21, where they're trying to have a policy of bringing people in and putting them in apartments and getting them on city-run buses and everything else so we can control them. And there's a couple of other nuances that they developed over the years since as well, because at the time they weren't thought of. And we'll get to that in a second. But what is the 10th? What is the 10th thing that Marx and Engels said that has to be done in order to communize a country? Education. Public schools. Free government education. And that has been a goal of the communists in this country since at least 1824. They have main goals they have never deviated from. Their two main goals are world government and doing away with God. These are provable, documentable. They have never deviated from them, and they have always gone in that direction, no matter what they've called each other, no matter whether they've appeared to be friends or enemies. If they have those goals, they are of what we call the master conspiracy. They've started parties. They started the Republican Party right during the Washington administration. It evolved into the Democrat Party. They called them Republican Democrats, and then finally they dropped the Republican and just kept the Democrat. And then they revived the term Republican in 1852, based on the earlier Republican Party. It is a documentable fact that the Republican Party, as you and I know, was started by the communist movement in the United States. It is a documentable fact. And go home, write this down. You got a little thing there you can write on there, write this name down. Alvin Beauvais, B-O-V-A-Y. Alvin Beauvais was an agent of the conspiracy who was in Young America, the Brotherhood of the Union, and was a leader at the Communist Commune in Ripon, Wisconsin, that went under the name of Ceresco, named after the goddess, the Roman goddess of the harvest. He is the guy that organized the Republican Party, along with, and then it was promoted by a man by the name of Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley was one of the top leaders of the communist movement in the United States. His newspaper, the New York Tribune, as a Sunday edition, had the biggest circulation of any newspaper in the United States on Sundays, because it was promoted by the communist movement. It wasn't simply a New York circulation newspaper. So where am I going with all of this? To dwell just briefly on the 10th part, they started, and you can read books by Samuel Blumenfeld and others that documents this fact very well, that they set out to control and capture the education system in the United States. Does anyone here not believe that they have been successful? This is not to condemn school teachers per se, because there's a lot of school teachers who are in the school systems who believe in good, sound education and are doing everything they can in spite of the system that they operate in. I know I've talked to a number of them that are just frustrated with their inability to teach and teach the right things. It has become a serious problem in many sections of the United States. At any rate, I won't dwell on that much any longer, other than to say that with each successive generation, the people have been dumbed down a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, to the point where today, by the very exclusion of God from the education system, you cannot teach the system that we know of as the American system of government if you cannot teach there's a God. If you cannot teach and mention God in schools, how can you teach them where they get their rights? You can't. And so all of these things have been at work for generations and generations, but one of the biggest things that they did about the time of Bismarck in Germany, and subsequently it really took on a huge portion of their program under Lenin, was health care. That had not been a problem, or I shouldn't say the word problem, but that had not been an issue in a program of the communist movement at the time that the Communist Manifesto was written. But it became part of the program under Bismarck and then under Lenin, to the point where Lenin said that socialized medicine is the keystone and the arch of the communist state. That's how important it is. Now, why is it so important? It's because it can control the people. You're a parent. Your child is sick, and you're in a socialized medicine, socialized medicine country. Maybe you don't quite have the right credentials when you go into the hospital, because they see, well, wait a minute, aren't you a part of this minority party? And you want us to treat your children? Go home. Do you think that this is impossibility? Anybody here ever heard of Nazi Germany and some of the things that they did there relative to your ability to get help for your children and things like that under that system? That maybe their ears weren't right, or they didn't have the right kind of parentage, or they didn't pass the medical test, or a mental test rather, or something like that. These things are real when the government gets control, a draconian government gets control of medicine. And medicine is not the right word, it's health care. You think in terms of medical care, or health care rather, as being something about medicine. If you read the Communist platform for 1972, it says we want universal health care for the American people, including universal medical care. What's the difference between health care and medical care? Well, a lot of it's got to do with this. It's not simply your body, it is also what's in here. And that's the insidious part of healthcare, is you don't understand that ultimately it is going to mean whether or not you are the right kind of thinker. Do you endorse the state? Do you have your kids in the right schools? Do you think you're going to be allowed to homeschool under health care? There are provisions in the health care that show and demonstrate that under certain provisions, the interpretation will be that you are deficient in raising your child if you have them in homeschool or a private institution of any kind. Now, you may not believe that, but let me ask you, do you want to actually have people interpret something that is so ambiguous that has the mindset of a communist and have control over your neighborhood, your house, your kids? There is a mandate in healthcare that the government come in and utilize every agency of the federal government to test you and your children as to stress in the home. Now, how many of you have a gun in your house? Oh, you don't have to tell me that. It's rhetorical. Get their names, will you? Yeah, how many do you have? Is that stressful? Well, not to you. That gives you peace of mind, doesn't it? But what about the government agent with the clipboard that asks you the question? Is that stressful? Yeah. So there are things like this that when you look at it and you start to apply them and you start to interpret them under a socialist sort of thought, you come to the realization that, wait a minute, this is not very good. This has nothing to do with medicine. It's my state of mind. And they come in and they want to lower crime in neighborhoods by coming into every home with the clipboard. Lowering stress not only in your home but at your workplace. Mandated. Also, they want to take a look at whether or not you have the right education for your child. And that's where homeschooling gets in. Is there progress in the education of your child? This will be an ongoing, monitored thing. And it is mandated that they come into your house to do it and use the armed forces and the police and the Department of Transportation and OSHA and every government agency there is to enforce it and apply it. I mean, you get in there and you start looking at it and it's there. Now they're going to start out in the high crime and poor areas as testing, sort of a laboratory. And then you read the regulations from there, and it implies that they will do it over the entire United States after they complete that task. That's the problem when you get into health care. Now, how important is this? The John Birch Society has been able to stop the advancement of the conspiracy in the years past because we understand a number of things. Primarily, we understand that things don't happen unless somebody plans it that way. People want something to happen, it happens. It is not an accident of history, it is not happenstance. Somebody wanted it to happen. The other thing that we recognize is that nothing happens in isolation. It has to do with a master plan. They formed this master plan as far as it went in the Communist Manifesto. And each one of those ingredients in the Communist Manifesto had to be implemented or the whole thing would fall apart. Lenin understood that and even expanded it to, as I recall, over 20 specific areas of society in general that they had to capture and control, or they would not be able to hold together a communist government. And that is something that we understand, that the fight over property rights, that the fight over Obamacare, that the fight over the North American Union, that the fight over nationalization of the police force, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, are only parts of a master plan. And if any of those, and any 2 or 3 of those, are failures for them, and they cannot implement them, then they have to slow the whole thing down to bring that up to be able to subjugate all of us all at once, or it won't work. And so when we can stop an Obamacare, when we can slow down the North American Union, when we can repeal this and do that and stop the national police force, that means the whole juggernaut is thrown off its timetable and they have to put on the brakes and wait for everything to catch up. And meanwhile, the rest of it atrophies, because then it gives more time for people like you and I to go out and educate the people as to what is really going on. And that's why they hate us. Because we understand that if we go out, as we did in the 60s and 70s, and stop the nationalization of the police force, when we lower the acceptance of the United Nations amongst the American people from 85% down to 35%, when we can do all these various things that has put a monkey wrench into their program, that's why they hate us, because we're the only ones that are doing it. I want you to tell me any organization in the United States right now that is working on 3 or 4 programs, such as the North American Union, get us out, the nationalization of our police force. Any one of those things will lead to a totalitarian government. Please tell me any other organization that's working on all 3. I'll wait. And you have to ask the question, why? No single issue will save this country. Not a single issue you can think of, as important as you believe it to be, will save this country. It has to be on a broad front. And it has to be on strategic things that are going to blow a hole in the agenda of the conspiracy. And so that is what is so important about the John Birch Society, is we are doing that. That's how we base everything that we do. And, you know, you don't see it like we see it at the national level, where they're constantly berating that this cause and that cause and the other, there's the Birchers behind it. In some cases it's true, in some cases it isn't. But it is intellectually true. For those of you who understand the communist movement, you can recognize it immediately when you see it in the streets, right? They use the same slogans, the same techniques, the same leaders, etc. Conversely, the other side sees it in the Tea Party movement and other movements when they see Birch slogans and the same intellectual thought and the same leaders and everything else, and they understand what's behind it. We're not everywhere at the same time. But when you've got the influence like Jim, when he was introducing John McManus, We don't know how many millions of people have seen Overview of America, but we know it's at a minimum of 7 million. We know that almost 5 million last year read articles out of the New American directly from that website. That's real influence, because these are not average citizens. These are political activists. These are people that think politically. And that is huge influence. And we've got plans to make that grow and grow and grow until it becomes the predominant news source in the whole movement. It's going to take some money to do it, but we're set on doing it because we have to do it. Because nobody else has this mindset of understanding that it's a conspiracy in which key issues must be stopped in order to throw their train off the tracks. We're not big enough yet to do it. The hope is that we can do it. It's relatively simple, but it's not easy. It's simple because we've identified those things that need to be done. The part that's not easy is assembling enough people and the resources in order to attack all of them at the same time to be able to just plain put them under the table. And so those are the things that we're going to be working on a national scale. What we want you to do is to think that way as well in the local area. Now let me sum this up. Here is to give you an idea of what we're fighting. Here is a page out of the Chicago Tribune, and you won't be able to see it, but this is a picture they took of a Mitt Romney press conference that Mitt was going to be at. In the sign on the podium, as well as the sign in the back, says, "Repeal and replace Obamacare." You see, it was repeal until the nomination was a done deal, wasn't it? Suddenly it's replace. Do you remember what they called something in Massachusetts? Romneycare. What was Obamacare patterned after? Romneycare. Robert Welch, maybe I'm going too far with this, but Robert Welch gave a speech some years ago, "What is communism?" In that speech, he named about 3 people who were communists with a small c. 2 of those 3 were Nelson Rockefeller and George Romney. I will leave it at that. The thing is, they need any system, whatever the name is, to destroy free enterprise in the field of medicine. They need that. If you are going to merge our country with Canada and Mexico, you need to, first of all, nationalize the police, because they have a national police force, the Federales, in Mexico, and a national police force in Canada called they used to call it the Northwest Mounted. I don't know what they call it now. You need to nationalize the banking system in order to merge it with these countries as well. You think that all of this financial disaster is an accident? Poor judgment? It has a plan of reducing the banking system down to something they can control so it can be merged with Canada and Mexico. Likewise with health care. You cannot merge a free health system with a socialized health system unless you first socialize the free one. That is what this is all about. If you stop the nationalization of the police, and if you stop what we call today Obamacare, they will not be able to merge. If they cannot merge, then that will stop the step towards getting fully under the United Nations. All these things have repercussions. All these things likewise have consequences. So these are very important issues, strategic issues, and things that we have to work on. And we can win. The majority of the people of the United States are with us. All we have to do is communicate better and organize them into a movement that is going to put this thing under. It can be done. It is being done in areas around the country right now. Where we have organized well enough, things are starting to change. So there is hope and change. If the economic situation starts, that's all you're going to have is change. But at any rate, I don't want to leave with a doom and gloom idea. I just wanted to bring these thoughts to you so you understand and appreciate the big picture and how some of these things fit into it. They are tiles in a mosaic. Without those tiles, the mosaic will not hold together. And so when every little thing that you do in your local area to stop Agenda 21, to stop the consolidation of your police departments, to be able to set back in the minds of your state representatives, the North American Union and everything else, has unbelievable consequences to the machine of the conspiracy. It'll slow it down. It'll put sand in it and give us more time and more time and more time to educate and organize the American people. Take hope. You can do it. It's being done already around the country. Thanks very much for coming out.